Session plan is a detailed outline created by a trainer to guide the delivery of a training session or lesson. It serves as a roadmap to ensure that the content is presented in an organized, logical, and effective manner, aligning with the learning outcomes and competencies outlined in the relevant training package or accredited course. The development of a session plan requires an understanding of the learner's backgrounds, the subject matter, and effective learning strategies. It is a critical tool in vocational education, where the focus is on practical, competency-based learning that equips students with specific skills and knowledge relevant to their chosen industry or profession.
It's time to start planning our first session. And what better way to start than with a session plan? So I'm going to walk you through a template of a very basic session plan here. There are some very complicated models out there that, quite honestly, can be quite confusing at times. So what I'll do is walk you through creating a session plan based on one of the units out of our learning program. For argument's sake, I'm going to be going with the workplace health and safety unit, and I'm going to be looking at a part of that unit to deliver within that 40 minutes. So let's have a look. The session plan starts with the what, when, where, and who of the training. The what is the lesson title, followed by the action and content. The when is the date the session will be held and the timing of the session elements. The where is the location of the delivery. And the who is the target or expected cohort, as well as the facilitator's name. I'm going to quickly bring up my learning program to get a little bit of detail about this training. Then I'm going to go to the unit of competency from training.gov to also get an idea of what I can actually complete realistically in 40 minutes. For this example, I'm going to use Performance Criterion 2.1, work with required personnel to set up and maintain consolidative arrangements. So I'll transfer what I know over to my session plan. Firstly, I'm going to rewrite the title to make more sense in the context of a learning environment. So I've chosen Consulting with the Right People for Work Health and Safety. Next, I'll enter the trainer's name, followed by the training room location and the date of delivery. I get my unit of competency from my learning program. And after considering my cohort, I put in a reasonable adjustment here for Mohammed, who's currently on crutches, so I'm going to make sure he has easy access to the door, so I'll seat him close to the door. So far so good. This is the easy stuff. We're just getting the information down before we start the more creative work of timing out our session and understanding what we're going to deliver and when, as well as the resources that are required. Before we start on the content of the session plan, it's probably a good idea to take the time now to think about how we want to deliver a session. In other words, what kind of activities do we want in it? How might we want to plan the start? In other words, like the introduction and maybe the way we want to prime our students to get ready. And also how we want to conclude the session. How do we wrap it up at the end to make it feel like a complete session? There's a couple of ways I do it that you may want to have a think about. The first thing I do is I tend to flesh out a basic PowerPoint slide deck. Why do I do this? It allows me to just throw my big ideas on a colourful page and basically get an idea of a flow of a session. It might just be an introduction slide followed by 2 or 3 content slides and a finish slide. The other thing I do is I use the session plan template itself as a bit of a brainstorming receptacle. I start with, okay, how am I going to start the session? What question do I want to ask the learners to get them thinking about the topic maybe more deeply or critically? And I might use the session plan to sketch out a few ideas. So what I start with and what I finish with are 2 totally different things. So with that in mind, we're going to have a look now at filling out the content, and we're going to use that ladder technique I just mentioned to run you through my process of doing it and see if it's something that you might also find useful for the way you create your session plans. Again, these skills are very transferable. It doesn't matter how long or how short the session is, the same skills apply. So let's go and have a look now. So the way I would start is by mapping out the main 3 components. And those 3 components are the introduction, the content, and the conclusion. I'd simply put them under those headings in the session plan. Next, I'd assign an amount of time to each one of those to span my 40 minutes. So you can see here, I've dedicated the majority of my time to my content. These will be different depending on when your session is scheduled. For example, if you were starting out a unit of competency at the start of the day that was going to run for an entire day, you might spend longer on the introduction to do more questioning and discussion. In this particular case though, it will be much shorter and more compact because we're not covering the entire unit. Next, I'm going to place some dot points under each of the main content headings to give me an idea of where this is going. I'm going to start with the introduction. In this case, it's consulting with the right people. So I might want to start my session with an open question about consultation. I'm just going to pop in a placeholder there by starting with a dot point and give myself a prompt about asking an open question. Next, I want to cover the work health and safety concerns for training room A3. If I plan to have any assessment throughout the day, I would put in some reference to what the assessment will be. But because this is such a short session, we might just do some formative questions and answers at the end. In the content, I've got to remember what unit I'm covering. In other words, the performance criteria as it's actually written, which is this: work with required personnel to set up and maintain consultative arrangements. So I'm thinking in a 40-minute session where only 33 minutes are going to be spent on content and activities, that I'm probably going to have enough time to go through who the required personnel are and what a consultative relationship might look like. So I've determined that based on my knowledge of how long a session of just 40 minutes feels like in a learning environment. Trying to cram too much information into a 40-minute session just makes it a lecture. And that's not what you're here to learn. We're here to learn to be facilitators, and facilitators require that two-way interaction throughout their session. So from this, I'm going to come up with a couple of dot points working on that premise, i.e., who are the required personnel and what is a consultative arrangement. In my conclusion, I've already determined that I want to do it as a formative question and answer period. So I'm simply going to put, again, a placeholder in there to say formative Q&A. And that will prompt me later to fill out that section with maybe a series of questions I want to ask, based on the content that, of course, I determine when I go back into this. We are yet to show what resources are required. So before I get off this page, let's go over to the resources and have a think about what needs to be there. At the outset, I know I'm going to have some PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to say PowerPoint slide 1, introduction. And I already know now, based on the basic content of this introduction, what's going to be in my first PowerPoint slide. So you'll notice for the conclusion, I've said a conclusion slide plus the answers to the Q&A. I might have them revealed in the slide presentation as we go through the questions and everyone comes up with their answers. So that's a basic structure of resources. I may have some handouts, I may have something else, but at this stage, this gives us a nice clear structure. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at fleshing this out with the content and furthering those resources and also breaking down the time that we spend on each section. It's time to put a little bit of extra content now into our session plan and round it out so it's ready to use. So here I've started with the introduction, and you can see I've done a few extra things here with regards to fleshing out what I want to actually say to the audience. Prompt in there, ask, and I've come up with a question that I think will be a good starter for my session. Why do you think it's important to obtain input from key staff before rolling out a WHS consultation process? And then I've put in there, form pairs to discuss for 90 seconds and hear back from each pair. So you can see already I'm thinking about interaction. This is facilitation, remember? So we're getting in there, we're asking people to pair up, have a think about the topic and come back. And then to state at the end, it's a regulatory requirement to consult with staff, and you might not know all these requirements. And that's the reason, or the hook if you like, to get people listening to the rest of your presentation. I've added in there to refer to the hazard report for the WHS coverage of the training room, A3. And I've added a little bit extra into the conclusion summary there, which is we will conclude with a 5-question Q&A at the end. So again, we're preparing the audience for what's going to happen by the end of this 40-minute presentation. So next is a couple of things you'll probably notice. I've broken down that 33 minutes that was for the entire content into smaller chunks to address each specific content heading, which I'll prepare a slide with some of the key learning points on it. Now, when it comes to coming up with the content of your presentation, in the real world, you'd probably refer back to the learner guide or textbook, wherever the information is stored for that learner after your training session. So I've done something similar here. I've looked at existing information and I've created some dot points within my session plan to make sure I cover these key points. I'm talking about sections of the Act and duties for those stakeholders. In the second 15 minutes, and don't worry, I know there's an extra 3 minutes waiting there somewhere, and we'll touch on that. I've chosen to run an activity for the entire second part. And you'll see here, in pairs, come up with a list of dot points that you consider important features of a workplace consultation. It's going to be a 5-minute activity, and when they come back, we're going to talk about the things that they discovered, plus we're going to make sure we cover these 4 dot points. You'll see there that also aligns with PowerPoint number 3, which I will probably leave at this stage with maybe an image on it, and then fill that image in with those 4 dot points once everybody comes back with their answers to the activity. Now, the conclusion, I've added some minutes to it, and this is why. Firstly, I thought to myself as I was going through this that this would take more time than the 3 minutes that I originally allowed. Secondly, I want this to be an active recall activity. I don't want to rush through it. So 6 minutes should be plenty of time to go through the 5 questions. You'll see I've highlighted in red the answers. That's just for the facilitator to read, obviously. On the right-hand side there, I've got answers to the Q&A. I'm still not convinced whether I'm going to put them on a slide or I'm going to hand them out or I'm just going to write them on a whiteboard. But I think this 40-minute session has come to a really satisfying conclusion, covering 2 major points with all their sub-points, which will form part of the takeaway for the students. So that's how you do it. That's one way of putting together a session plan. As I mentioned, there's other ways. You can start with the slides, or you can start with just a brainstorm idea on a piece of paper and then come and fill in your session plan later. There's no absolute way to do it. And even the layout of the session plan, there's a lot of institutions out there that use facilitator guides as opposed to session plans with dot points similar to this, but they'll have images of the slides that back up that image so you know exactly where you are. I think with any session plan, it's one of those documents that if you can't run the session for any reason, a person with the same competencies as you should be able to pick it up and run with it and know exactly what they have to do. So the way it's arranged isn't important. It's more about the substance within it and how easy it is to follow.